So today I thought I would tell a little story and a little history about how we got to where we are today. Well, we being me. So, hey, stay tuned to the end of this video because I'm going to show you how you can obtain your own copy of the Boa Constrictor issue from Reptiles Magazine of November of 1996, where I first explain the boa constrictor gestation period and the way all the details of how I bred my boas back then, which incidentally is the same way I do today. And I'll autograph it for you if you want it. If you're corny enough that you want it autographed, I'll autograph it for you. But stay tuned to the end of the video, and I'll show you how we can make that happen. Enjoy! So, when I was a little kid, I was always an animal kid. You know, I always loved animals. I remember when I was 5 or 6, maybe, sitting on my grandfather's lap, and he had this book from National Geographic. I think it was Animals of North America, something like that. It was, like an encyclopedia loaded with pictures, and he'd just read to me about animals. And so I was just fascinated with animals. My grandmother told me a story when I became an adult of when we'd go to the zoo. I knew what all the animals were when I was like 8 or 9 years old. I could rattle off what the animals were. And they were just amazed at how much I knew about animals. It was just something I was really interested in. I just really liked animals. And one summer, I was out playing, and one of the older boys on the block, this is in Norridge, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. And one of the older boys had caught a garter snake, and I just thought that was awesome. He was running around scaring girls with it and stuff, and I wasn't scared of it. I was just enthralled, thinking, well, this is it. I wonder if I could catch a snake, because we couldn't, or there were no other wild animals, you could catch in Norridge. Norridge is suburb. I mean, literally, I was a half a block from Chicago, where I was in Norridge. Literally half a block. I was in the middle of a street on a block in the middle. And if you went all the way to the north, you were in Chicago. And that actually is where there were some fields where you could catch a garter snake, because you wouldn't catch them in people's yards typically, because people were cutting grass and whatnot. So it was a rougher life if you're a garter snake trying to survive, in suburbia where houses are on top of houses and there's these lots that are 40 feet wide, and little brick houses all along. So I asked my mom, I said, if I catch a snake, can I have a snake for a pet? She said, sure. She was a tomboy as a kid, and she caught lizards and snakes herself. So she had no fear of them. And I had to get my dad's permission too. So I asked my dad, and he grew up in northern Minnesota where they had snakes, no venomous snakes. And he said, sure, you can have a snake if you catch a snake, because we weren't allowed to have a dog or a cat because they didn't want the dog or cat to shed on the carpet. And I think they just didn't want the work, really, even though my mom really loved animals too. And we actually had a cat from time to time, and when I was a kid, but I got permission to, if I caught a snake, that I could have it. So I went out to the field where this neighbor kid had caught the garter snake, and I commenced to look for a snake. And you know how you do it. You lift up stuff, boards and old signs or tin or whatever's on the ground. You lift it up and hope to find a snake. So I had no idea how to catch a snake. I had no idea what would happen if I caught a snake. And I didn't catch the first one I saw, for sure. You get familiar with that sound of a snake rustling through the grass, as it's crawling away, trying to escape you when you're trying to catch it. And eventually I caught one. I caught a garter snake. It musked all over me, which reeked. And I don't know if it was the first one, but one of the first ones I got bit me. And I thought, this is this is the best. This is just fantastic. And that was the day that I became obsessed with snakes. And that was a while ago. That was in the mid 60s, mid to late 60s, before most of you were born. And believe it or not, they had snakes back then. Unlike cell phones, we didn't have cell phones. You know, back in the olden days, your phone had a rotary dial on it. You had to dial each number and then wait for it to go back and then dial another number. And it wasn't, you know, touch tone. And it was connected by a cord to the wall. And most households had one, and which we had. And there was a cord attached, and you had to be within a cord's length to talk on the phone. We're talking olden days, folks. But at any rate, that's and that was the first at any rate. For those of you playing at home, there will be many at any rates in this video. So, at any rate, caught my first garter snake. I don't even know what I kept it in, probably a bucket or something, and it got away in the house, and I didn't know where it was. I didn't tell my mom that it had gotten loose, or my dad. I mean, nobody knew. I just thought, well, I'm probably going to be in trouble if they find it, and it was a while. And one day, my mom said, look what I found, and she showed me, she had in the bucket a garter snake. She said, this was under the sink in the kitchen. You can't let them get loose. You have to keep them secure. Okay. You know, I wasn't in trouble. And she picked it up, you know, no problem, because she wasn't scared of snakes. So I remember from that point on, anytime I'd go to the library. Have you heard of libraries? It's a place where there are books. There was no internet back in the olden days. You go to the library, and then you'd go to a cabinet called a card file, and you'd look up a keyword. We didn't call them keywords back then because we didn't have Google. But you'd look up a keyword, and I would look up snakes or boa or python, you know, anything on that order, and then I would, you know, get the number, the reference number of where it was. You'd go to the shelf and find that book. You'd find a section that had a whole bunch of snake books. So I was absorbing as much of that as I could. I just loved the snake stuff. Sometimes I'd go to a new library just to look at the books that they had on snakes. And I was particularly drawn to the big snakes, which is kind of normal. Most snake kids initially are really interested in the big snakes. So I was interested in boas and pythons. I remember seeing a picture of an Indian python, and that was just an awesome looking animal. You know, looked just like a Burmese python, but it was really, really chunky. And so I dreamed of having one of those. Didn't get one till I was an adult, but I actually never got an Indian. I had a Burmese. But I always wanted to have one. My dad helped me build a cage. We built a cage that was 2 feet high, 2 feet deep, 4 feet long, and lined it with concrete. If you can believe that, the thing had to weigh 150 pounds. Lined it with concrete, put stalagmites in it, and it was really, really coarse, rough. Would have been a terrible surface to have a snake in. And I aspired to buy myself either a boa constrictor or a Burmese python, and I had like $10, and they were like $18 at the pet shop. And I never quite got enough to buy one, which is in retrospect probably good, because I wouldn't have had the wherewithal to feed it, to be able to afford the rats and mice to be able to feed the thing. So I didn't get one, and it wasn't until I became an adult in about 1984 or so, I acquired a Burmese python, and it was terrible. It was just a mean, nasty snake. And I traded it for a boa, which was a good day. And had that boa for quite some time. And then I was living in West Virginia, in Clarksburg, West Virginia, at the time, quite some time, months, not years. And then I looked in a local newspaper, one of these free flyers where you can run an ad for free. And there was an ad in there, or I had placed an ad in there, saying, "So your mom won't let you keep your snake. Call me, I'll come get it." Or something like that. Basically looking for a free snake, looking for a rehomable snake for free. And a guy responded to it. He said, "What are you trying to say here exactly?" He said, "Well, I was just looking for somebody who needed to get rid of a snake because their mom wouldn't let him keep it or whatever, and that I could get for nothing." He said, "Oh, I see." I said, "Well," and I got talking to him a little bit. "Oh yeah, I've got some boa constrictors." I thought, "Oh wow, boa constrictors, that's awesome." And I ended up going to his house. The guy's name was Greg Kuhar, Kuhar, in Clarksburg, and he had all these snakes inside of what was an old TV case. So back in the olden days, again, a TV case or a TV came in a big console case. So in this particular instance, it was like the size of a dresser, and the TV was taken out of it, and he put in hardware cloth on the front, and he had some kind of a heating mechanism underneath the bottom, built into the bottom. I don't know what it was. I didn't see it, but he had some kind of heat in the bottom. He had about 4 boas in there, and he said he really liked the dark ones. He said he had that light one there. I'll sell that one, and that was Big Mama. Creative name, right? So to me, I had hoped that it was a female. I didn't know how to tell the difference. At any rate, was that 3? So, anyways, he told me he'd sell me the light one for $100, and the light one was about 5.5, 6 feet. Maybe that big around. Healthy animal. He had bought her in 1976 at a pet shop in downtown Clarksburg. Pet shop I'd been to many, many times, looking, peering through the glass at the boas that they would have for sale. And so I bought that animal and I brought her home, built a big cage. It was 4 feet by 8 feet, big cage. Made it out of plywood. It was 2 feet high, so I kind of laid out how you would cut the plywood to get the maximum efficiency out of it. So I ended up cutting it, ripping it in half, and that was a side wall. It took me, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sheets of plywood. This is when plywood wasn't, $60 a sheet or whatever it is now. It was like $8 a sheet. And I screwed it together with wood screws, which are terrible. The plywood was really easy to strip with it. I didn't know about piloting screw holes, but I got it together. So it was 4 feet by 8 feet. I put a divider in the center, and the top of it was the doors. So I had the 4 foot by 4 foot doors, and I cut out a big opening, leaving about 8 inches of frame all the way around. And I covered the inside, from the inside, with 1/2 inch hardware cloth. On both doors, I could open the doors independently. So there were 2 halves to the cage. And I had the smaller boa, and then I had Big Mama. So they each lived in one half of the cage. And I was buying rats. Rats were pretty cheap, and I was feeding them both well. And I decided, I wonder if you could breed boas. And I didn't know anybody other than Greg Kuhar with boas. And I asked him about it, and I talked to him from time to time after that. And he said he thought they were really hard to breed because he'd had his for years, and he never had any babies, and they were all together all the time. And it could be he had all females. I don't know. I don't know why he didn't have babies. He had a setup that, in retrospect, he definitely could have had babies. Very likely could have had babies. If I kept boas and I had males and females in the same cage in the same way that he did, which was a perfectly adequate way to have them housed, I would have had babies. But he didn't have babies, so I suspect that his boas just happened to all be females. I didn't know how to tell the difference between a male and a female. Um, I had heard that boas had spurs, which is down next to the vent. There are the remnants of legs, which, if you read your Bible, you know that snakes once didn't crawl on their belly. But so, at any rate, that's a sidebar, and that's number 4 for at any rate. But they have vestiges of, or the remnants of what were legs. So that's what makes boas and pythons boas and pythons. That's one of the primary things that differentiates them from other snakes. So I looked, and I could see 2 spots on Big Mama that were dimples. And down in the very bottom of the dimple, there was a little teeny tiny speck of a spur. I could just barely see it. I had no idea what that meant. I just knew, well, that's the remnant of legs, and that's the spurs. But at some point, I became aware of a guy in Ohio. His name is Bill Page. I don't know if he's even alive anymore. But he was friends with Don Hamper at the time, which a lot of people know of Don Hamper. And I tried to call Don Hamper, was unable to get a hold of him. And I got this Bill Page's number, and I talked to him about boas and pythons. He was one of the original breeders of blood pythons. There was, kind of a little cult of the guys that were successful breeding some of these rarer pythons, and he was one of those guys that had bred blood pythons back in the 80s. And he said that he didn't know for sure what size the spurs would be on a male, but he tried to explain to me how to probe. Well, that didn't seem like something I really wanted to try. I was nervous about that, and I didn't have any probes. And he said that he thought that the spurs on a male would be big enough that you could see them pretty easily, and that a female might not be very big. So that's how you would tell the difference, that one would have much, much bigger spurs than the other. So I told him I appreciated that, and set about trying to find a male. So at that time, my grandmother lived in the Chicago area. I lived in Clarksburg, West Virginia, and I'd go and visit my grandma about once a year for about a week. And I went up there, and then there was a local paper called Trading Times. And in the Trading Times, they had a miscellaneous pet section, and one of those ads was for a boa constrictor. And I went to the house where these people had a boa constrictor, and it was just like Big Mama. It was for sale for $100. And in this particular case, the parents were watching the boa constrictor for their son who had gone to college. And the son had basically abandoned the boa and left the parents to take care of it. And it was like in about a 40-gallon long aquarium, and it had a screen lid, and the bottom there was a plate, literally a plate. So it had about that deep of a recess in it, if you were going to put water in it. And they said that they watered it through the screen onto the plate periodically, when the bowl would go dry. And that's how Big Daddy, shocker, that's how Big Daddy got a drink. There were 3 or 4 shed skins around the cage and some petrified poop. And they said they only opened it to throw a rat in, about once a month. And so I took it right out, and they stood way back, and they were fearful of it. And you can't blame people for being afraid of them. You're just kind of raised with that. But they took $100, and I took Big Daddy and a pillowcase, kept him in my grandma's house, no heat, for a few days until I went back to West Virginia, put him in the cage with Big Mama. And guess what happened? Big Daddy seemed to be really interested in Big Mama for some reason. And before I bought it, when I went to these people's house. They lived on LaGrange, very close to Tinley Park, the big Tinley Park snake party, coincidentally. And he had huge spurs. They were like 3/16 of an inch long, and he was really, really skinny, real skinny as a rope, and probably 7 feet. You know, a big male. I don't have any males that big, but and he was a they thought he was about 10 years old, but he probably was. I don't really know. But he had gigantic spurs, so I was confident that he was a male. And then because Big Mama, I couldn't even see her spurs, I was confident that she was a female. So I took him, put him in with her, and he climbed around on her, and just hung with her. And I didn't know what you're supposed to do to breed boas. I didn't know the recipe. At the time, I didn't know it's critical that you cool your boas before you breed them, right? You have to cycle them. Well, there wasn't anything like that in any of the books that I'd read because there weren't any books on how to breed boas. There was still no internet. Thankfully, no Google. No resource, no way to find out. And I didn't know anybody that bred boas. And the only person I knew that had much experience with them was Greg Kuhar, and I asked him about it, and that's when he told me, I don't think they're easy to breed because I've never had any babies. That's what Greg said. So I was still determined that I wanted to try. Why not? I've always been kind of a critical thinker. I live in Missouri now, the show me state, and I'm kind of a show me kind of guy. If my doctor says this is the way to treat this particular symptom that you're having, sorry, doc, I'm going to look it up and make sure I agree, because I'm not going to assume because you've been to college and gone to school for 100 years. I'm not going to assume that is the best. So, not that I'm smarter than the doctor, but I'm going to research it and make sure that the information I'm getting is accurate for treating me, my wife, and my family. And I've often found better ways, but that's a completely different story. So I almost said it. That was almost number 5, but I'm holding back. I have a daughter that gives me grief about saying at any rate too much. So I'm trying to resist the temptation. So I had the cage set up it was dangerous in retrospect, really dangerous. I had a regular 100-watt light bulb that I mounted on a piece of wood that I covered with one layer of tinfoil. And I mounted it so it was a little bit off the wood. And the bottom of the cage, the floor of the cage was raised up just a little bit from the floor, like 6 inches. So there was a gap. And in this gap was that piece of plywood that had foil on it, and then a light bulb mounted. It was sitting sideways this way, and then the bottom of the cage, I had tinfoil on the bottom of the cage, and I set that thing right in the center of the cage so that both halves had kind of an area that was a little bit warm, and then I had a little space heater in the room that kept the room itself about 82 degrees with the cheapy onboard thermostat that it had. I just adjusted it until I was getting about 82 in the room, no thermostat in the room. And that turned out to be, guess what? That's the way the boaphile still breeds his boas, except I don't use the light bulb. So, same temps, same heating style or basic symptom. It worked. I had my first litter of babies in February of 1986. And guess what? I have been breeding them the same way ever since. So, in all my travels in the books, I didn't find anything about cycling boa constrictors who live in the tropics in South and Central America, where there is minimal change in temperature through the year. There's a wet season, And the light cycles change. They change actually if you're near the equator, it changes twice a year, which is weird. I don't try to mimic that. But there is a wet season and dry season, so that is mimicked naturally by our weather. And that is my basic philosophy in how you breed your boas. You've got to keep them together, or you've got to get them together. And since then, I've learned that there's a best time of year to do that, where you're most likely to have success, most likely that the female will be cycling herself, that is, developing egg follicles, so that the male will be interested when you put the male in. The male will smell the smell of the female is cycling, probably giving off pheromones, which puts him in the mood, makes him interested, and then he will court her until eventually they will copulate, and then 4 months later they will have babies. But I didn't know any of that. I didn't know that it took months of courtship. I didn't know the length of the gestation period. I didn't know there was one particular time of year that was the best time of year. I think I picked up Big Daddy in around February. It was cold, and put him in with her right away. But given the fact that she didn't have babies until February, it was February 17th, 1986, she had to have ovulated 4 months before that. I didn't know that that's when she was going to ovulate because I hadn't figured that out yet. But so 4 months prior to that is when she had ovulated. So he was in with her courting for months, probably 6 months, 8 months, 6 to 8 months before she ovulated. And I just thought, they're in love. This is what they do. They're just kind of hanging out, usually with him on top of her, a lot of times with his head resting on her head. So no matter where the back end of his body was, and if he had his tail coiled over her tail, so that they were vent to vent, he was trying to court, trying to breed her. Somehow the head of the male would usually, Big Daddy would find his head on top of the female's head, which is really interesting. I don't quite understand that behavior. So I started having babies. Didn't cycle them. Didn't cycle the males. Didn't cycle the females. Didn't do anything with light cycle. Didn't try to do anything with humidity or temperature. Tried to keep the temperatures as steady as possible, which is the same way I do it today, 40 years later. And I should also say, when I'm going through this stuff and just, you're listening to my dribble, I'm just telling you how I did it. I'm not telling you that this is the only way to do it, because it's not. There are people that cycle and they have success. There are people that don't cycle, like me, and they have success. I just saw a couple of posts, where somebody was commenting on the video that I just did talking about the introducing males to females. And in no way did I ever say, this is the way you need to do it. This is the only way it's done. So I had commented that I put the male on top of the female so that she knows it's not food. That's the only reason why I put the male on top of the female. I don't put the male on top of the female because otherwise the male can't find the female. To the moron who suggested that. I put the male on the female after I've alerted the female that something is going on, so that the female doesn't accidentally bite the male thinking he's a meal, which I explained in the video. But for some reason, a couple of morons decided that they're smarter because they don't do it that way, and I'm an idiot because I do. Well, none of us are idiots because of that. Or because we introduce them in different ways. That's not what makes any of us an idiot. So there's many ways to introduce a male. That's just the way that I introduce my males. So I've been going on here for almost a half an hour. So what else could I possibly talk about? Well, at some point in about 1989 or so, I'd had 3 or 4 litters of boas, and I went to a local herp meeting at the Minnesota Herpetological Society. I'd heard about that. I don't remember who I heard about it from, but I became a member of it and went to the monthly meetings. And I met a guy there named Jim Gerhold, who was a rattlesnake guy, actually, a reptile expert extraordinaire, knows 100 times more than I'll ever know about reptiles, and I mean that seriously. I know more about boas, but I'm not that humble. But I know more about boas and about breeding and keeping boas than he does. But reptile natural history and taxonomy, species, I mean, he could identify anything from a picture. It's just, and remember the scientific names, and as he'll tell you, he could remember how to spell those scientific names, which I would never even attempt. But I told him about these breeding boas. He was kind of fascinated because he likes all reptiles. He asked me if I had been keeping any records, and I told him I hadn't. He said, you should keep records. You might learn something. So you should record feeding and shedding, everything you possibly can. So I decided I would start to do that. This is my notebook. Now, I don't use a notebook anymore. I have a computer and an Excel spreadsheet. So that's where I keep my records now. But I still have this, and I recorded the name of the animal, events that took place, with the animal, feeding and breeding or ovulation, thickening, things like that, in the early days. And I just recorded all that info, not having any idea why I would need to do it, but I decided I would, thinking it's not going to hurt. It might be good for me sometime down the road. So there was a time, let me get this out of here. We'll edit that out. So there was a time in about 1992 or 93, I'd been breeding boas for 6 years or so. I'd had, I don't know, maybe it was 94. Anyways, I had about 25 litters or something like that total. I knew how to do it. I didn't know why it happened. I didn't know why particular dates worked, or I didn't know the length of the gestation period. I didn't know exactly how a shed would correspond to breeding or ovulating or birth. I didn't know any of that stuff. Nobody did. So I started to list. I just sat down with my giant notebook and I went through all of those sheets from those females and wrote down when they ovulated or when I saw what I thought was ovulation. And I definitely knew the shed dates. I had those written down. So so I sat down with my notebook and my notes on my boas. And what did I have here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. I sat down with my list, and I had like 15 boas that I had bred. And I was just trying to determine when the best time was to put a male in with a female. Try to predict, based on the shed date, when was the ideal time to put the male in, thinking there was a pre-birth or pre-breeding shed. And I didn't ever figure out what the pre-breeding shed date was or how that would correlate to when you should put the male in. I didn't figure that out. I never did. But I had listed, I'll show you my list. I had this list. This is the foundation of the history of how we learned the length of the gestation period in boa constrictors. Amazing, right? And we know that because I figured it out. And I published it, or Reptiles Magazine published it, after the article I had written had been submitted to them. That has a little story of itself, or of its own as well. So I had written down what I thought was an ovulation, and then I wrote down what I thought was a shed, or what was a shed, after what I thought was an ovulation. And then I wrote down the date of the birth. Shed date I knew with certainty. The date of birth I knew with certainty. And looking at that and just sitting there trying to contemplate this, for hours on my couch in Apple Valley, Minnesota. We'd moved to Minnesota by then. I was trying to determine when the best time was to put a male in with a female, which I didn't figure out. But what I'd stumbled onto was that there seemed to be a relation between the shed date and the date of birth, which nobody knew. Nobody had figured it out. Nobody tried to figure it out. And probably at that time, 15 or so litters, probably no one else had ever bred 15 boas. I probably had bred more boas than anybody else had, at least for sure, as far as I knew. But they had given birth at the following. So I'm going to read off the numbers quick. From the shed date until the date of birth, 108 days, 108 days, 104 days, 105 days, 100 days, 98 days, 105 days, 105 days, 101 days, 102, 105, and 96. And I was excited when I looked at that because I knew, hey, I have stumbled onto something. There's a relationship. And then I looked back onto when I thought was the day of ovulation, the date that I saw this massive swelling for each of those females. And from the date that I had written down in my notebook for each female, the date that I thought was ovulation and their shed date was this many days, as follows: 16, 17, 18, 19, 15, 16, 16, 17, 16. And then I have one here that I've written 18 and one that I have, and 57 on the same one. I'll tell you more about that in a little bit. Then 16 and 17. So the reason why I had one listed at 18 and then at 57 is because I hadn't identified ovulation correctly. So I thought that she had ovulated quite a while before that. Let's see, it's about 40 days. About 40 days earlier, I had marked her down as ovulating, but she didn't. And then I marked down another day that I thought, now she looks like she's ovulating. So I had both of those dates, and one of them was 18 days from when I thought she had ovulated, and the other one was 57. Turned out the 18 was the correct one, because after that shed, at 18 days, after the second, what I thought was the second ovulation, which probably the actual ovulation, she gave birth 102 days after that, which is 120 days total gestation period. So I was onto something. So I wrote an article, and as I want to do, I just procrastinated with it, didn't send it anywhere. And I sent it to a buddy of mine named Carl May in Florida. And he read it. He said, wow, this is fantastic. You've got to submit this to Reptiles Magazine. And he gave it to Dick Bartlett. Dick Bartlett is a legend. Again, another reptile guy that knows, he knows 1,000 times more than I'll ever know. But he wrote articles for NOAA, the Northern Association of Reptile Keepers, forever, for free. And then when Reptiles Magazine started, they hired him to write for them, and he wrote for them for many, many years. He's got the longest lived, privately held by a single person, radiated tortoise. It's coming close to 80 years that he's owned that animal. And he's older than that, but he's still around. He sent that magazine, or he sent that article that I wrote into Reptiles Magazine, and Reptiles Magazine contacted me and said, we would like to publish your article. And that article was published in this issue of Reptiles Magazine, published in, let's see, I should have that memorized, the November of 1996 issue of Reptiles Magazine, known at the time as the Boa Constrictor issue. So that was when I ended up on the map. We didn't have internet yet, or most people didn't have internet. A few geeks did, but I didn't know anything about the internet yet. I probably knew some people that had internet, but I didn't. And so when that came out, that really shook up the reptile world, because nobody knew all these things about breeding boa constrictors. And so it was a really, really big deal. So at the time, I had a lot of people accuse me of making it up. They didn't know me. I could have made it up. For whatever reason, I didn't. There's a reason why I didn't, because that's not what I do. But so I just put in there the numbers as I had them, and then the information on the specifics on breeding boas that I had gleaned after having bred, by that time, maybe 25 litters, something like that, not very many. And sent the article in to Reptiles Magazine. Phil Samuelson, I think his name is Phil Samuelson, was the editor at the time. And this is the centerfold of the article. He wanted to call it Confessions of a Boa Breeder. I thought that sounded stupid. So I suggested, how about Revelations of a Boa Breeder? And he said he liked that. That was better, so he changed it to Revelations of a Boa Breeder. And that is where the bulk, and I mean the bulk, of what we know today to be true about breeding boa constrictors was first published. It was in this magazine, November 1996, written by yours truly, Jeff Rooney. So I was thinking that we should do something with this. I bought a bunch of them when they first came out. Reptiles Magazine told me later on it was their first issue to sell out, because they typically would have several hundred extras so people could order them. This was sold out in like a month, I think, because I bought so many. I was pretty excited. Here's a cabinet maker published in a magazine. I bragged about it to friends and family. It's a pretty big deal to me. Just a hack. I had actually written an article. So I was thinking, how would you like to have this? This copy. So this is a brand new copy. Still got the little inserts in it even. So I was thinking we could give one of these away. So I'm going to give one of these away to someone who posts in the comments. So at random, we're going to go through all the names. We're going to list them all, put them all on a piece of paper, and we're going to pull out a name and send one of these to the one of the people that makes a comment about this particular article within the after this video. So you need to comment on it, and then I'll answer within the comment that you've won and then you can I'll have you contact me directly so I can get your address. So if you want, I will autograph it, which to me is a little silly, but I've had many people ask me for an autograph. So some people like that sort of thing. So I will autograph it both on the cover and on the front page of the article if you win it, and it won't cost you a thing. So at any rate, did it again. That is the reason why you should comment, is because you get an opportunity to get a copy of this monumental boa constrictor breeding article that was in Reptiles Magazine, written by me and published in 1996, which was 28 years ago. Sorry, I'm laughing at my own jokes. I do that all the time. I laugh at everything. 28 years ago now, this was published. And I proved the skeptics who said I was lying and just made it up, I proved them wrong. You can breed boa constrictors without cycling them, without breeding them like pythons, without breeding them like colubrids. You just breed them like the boaphile did, which is pretty simple. House them clean, give them clean water, give them a temperature that they're happy with, so you provide a thermal gradient so they can be as warm as they want to be or as cool as they want to be. Put a male in with the female, warm the female up during the gestation period so she can cook those babies properly, and you'll get babies. That's all there is to it. And that works that way whether you put the male directly on the female or you just let him just slither in there, because miraculously, even though I didn't say it in the last video, he will find the female. Shocking. Anyways, you can tell I was a little perturbed by that. I tend to take that kind of thing a little bit, probably too personally. Anyways, that's it. I have rambled on long enough. At any rate, I think that's 7 times I said it. I am never going to get over that. Hey,